Story 1. This story is about a military base that has been the site of strange and terrifying occurrences for years. Fort Rucker, an abandoned outpost from the early 1900s, situated deep in the woods. For decades, it was a site of military training, but after a particularly gruesome event during World War I, the base was abandoned without any official explanation. Years later, the mystery of what happened at Fort Rucker remained unsolved, but the stories kept emerging. It all started in 1918. The base had been used for military training, with soldiers often sent to the area for drills and exercises. One morning, after a particularly brutal storm, a group of soldiers went missing during a routine training session. They had been instructed to march deep into the woods surrounding the base for a training exercise, but when the time came for them to return, they never showed up. Search parties were dispatched immediately. The soldiers' comrades combed the woods for days, but they found no trace of them. No footprints, no campsites, no signs of struggle. The only clue that remained was an eerie silence that seemed to envelop the forest, making the search feel like an impossible task. Then, after a few weeks, a bizarre and horrifying discovery was made. A group of local hunters stumbled across a clearing deep in the woods where they found a dilapidated shack, one that no one had ever seen before. When they entered, they found the missing soldiers, alive but changed. Their bodies were stiff, their eyes wide and glassy, and their skin was an unnatural shade of gray. They were standing perfectly still, their mouths agape in what could only be described as a permanent scream. Their uniforms were torn and tattered, as though they had been exposed to some kind of unimaginable horror. The soldiers didn't speak. They didn't move, just stood there like mannequins in a trance. The hunters tried to approach them, but when they did, the soldiers suddenly collapsed, their bodies folding unnaturally in on themselves. When the soldiers were transported back to the base, they were found to have no memory of the time they'd spent in the woods. They couldn't remember where they had been or what had happened to them. Some of them died soon after, their bodies deteriorating rapidly as though their life force had been drained. The rest of the soldiers were sent back home, but they couldn't escape the nightmare. Many reported seeing strange figures lurking in the shadows of their homes. Others claimed to hear whispers in the night, voices calling their names from the darkness. As the years passed, the stories of the vanished soldiers became folklore, and people began to avoid the area around Fort Rucker. Strange lights and shadowy figures were seen near the woods, and the area became infamous as a cursed place. In the 1950s, a group of historians and paranormal investigators decided to visit the abandoned fort, hoping to uncover the truth behind the mystery. What they found was far more terrifying than they could have imagined. When they explored the remains of the fort, they found strange markings carved into the walls of the old barracks, symbols that didn't match any known language. And in the deepest part of the woods, they discovered the shack where the soldiers had been found, but it was completely empty. Not a trace remained. The investigators reported hearing whispers and feeling a strange chill, as though something was following them. But it wasn't until they ventured deeper into the woods that things took a darker turn. They found remnants of military equipment scattered along the ground, broken weapons and torn uniforms. But no one was there, no bodies, nothing. It wasn't until they returned to the base that they realized something chilling. There was no record of the soldiers' disappearance in the official archives. Nothing. It was as if they had never existed at all. To this day, Fort Rucker remains an unsolved mystery. Some believe that the soldiers were victims of some kind of supernatural force. while others think they were victims of an experiment gone wrong. But the truth, no one knows. What's most unsettling, however, is that those who visit the woods near the base still report strange occurrences. Voices in the trees, figures moving in the shadows, and the feeling that the lost soldiers are still out there, waiting. Story 2. This story is about a centuries-old mansion that still stands today, though no one dares to go near it. Blackthorn Manor, located on the outskirts of a small village, was once home to the powerful and wealthy Blackthorn family, known for their influence in local politics and business in the 18th century. But what was once a symbol of prosperity and grandeur is now infamous for the dark secrets it holds. In the late 1700s, the Blackthorn family lived in the manor peacefully. At least, that's what the outside world thought. Inside, however, there were whispers of strange occurrences, eerie events, and unexplainable happenings that no one dared to speak of. The patriarch of the family, Lord Edward Blackthorn, was a known alchemist and scholar who became obsessed with the idea of immortality. Rumors spread that he had been experimenting with dark magic in the hopes of finding a way to extend his life. And as his obsession grew, so did the strange happenings within the manor. It was in the dead of night when the first unsettling incident occurred. Lady Eleanor Blackthorn, Lord Edward's wife, was found wandering the halls of the manor in a trance-like state. She was muttering incomprehensible words and dragging behind her a large, ancient book that seemed to glow in the moonlight. When she was found, she couldn't remember how she had ended up in the hall, nor did she recognize the book. From that moment on, strange things started happening more frequently. Servants reported hearing footsteps echoing through empty halls, objects moving on their own, and strange lights appearing in the windows when no one was inside. But the most terrifying event occurred one stormy night in 1795. On that night, Lord Blackthorn had been working in his study, as he often did, surrounded by his alchemical books and dark potions. The mansion's servants heard loud bangs and cries coming from the study, but when they entered, they found it locked. No one dared approach it for hours. When they finally managed to get the door open, they found the study in ruins. Books torn to shreds, tables overturned, and shattered glass everywhere. But the most chilling thing was that Lord Blackthorn was nowhere to be found. A search was conducted, but despite combing every inch of the manor and grounds, Lord Blackthorn was never found. The servants who lived at the manor left, and the house was abandoned, left to rot for decades. But the mysteries didn't stop there. Over the years, villagers spoke of hearing music coming from the manor late at night, even though no one had lived there for years. Some claimed to see a shadowy figure standing in the window, while others reported seeing an old woman dressed in a gown, walking through the gardens. In the 1920s, a group of paranormal investigators from London decided to visit Blackthorn Manor, determined to uncover the truth behind the family's disappearance. They set up their equipment and entered the house, ready to capture any evidence of the supernatural. But what they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. When they entered the main hall, the temperature dropped drastically, and their breath was visible in the air. A feeling of oppressive dread hung over them. As they ventured deeper into the manor, they began to hear voices, whispers in a language they couldn't understand. In the study where Lord Blackthorn had vanished, they found the same ancient book that Lady Eleanor had carried that night years ago. It was lying open on the floor, its pages flipping rapidly as though being turned by an unseen force. And then, in the dim light of their lanterns, they saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the room. It was Lord Blackthorn, or at least it looked like him. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his skin was pale and stretched tightly over his bones. He was muttering something under his breath, the words indistinguishable, as if repeating an incantation. As the investigators tried to approach, the figure vanished into thin air, and the whispers grew louder, echoing through the manor. The investigators fled, terrified, and when they returned to town, they spoke of what they had witnessed. Since then, no one has dared to enter Blackthorn Manor. It remains abandoned, its windows boarded up, the grounds overgrown with weeds. But on certain nights when the wind is howling and the moon is full, villagers say you can still hear the sound of music coming from inside the manor. And sometimes, if you're close enough, you can see the faint silhouette of Lord Blackthorn standing in the window, still searching for the immortality he never found. Story 3. This story is about a centuries-old chapel located in the heart of an old, quiet town, St. Augustine's Chapel. The chapel, built in the late 1600s, stands near a steep cliff overlooking the ocean. Over the years, it became known not only for its rich history and stunning architecture, but also for a dark legend that lingers around it. In the early 1700s, the chapel was the site of a brutal tragedy. A young woman named Catherine Moreau, the daughter of a prominent local family, had been promised to a wealthy merchant in an arranged marriage. But Catherine was in love with another, Pierre Duval, a poor fisherman whom her family did not approve of. Despite the objections, the two planned to run away together. One fateful evening, just before they were to flee, Catherine and Pierre met at the chapel. They had planned to marry in secret and then escape under the cover of darkness, but things went terribly wrong. As Catherine waited in the candlelit chapel, Pierre never showed. Hours passed, and Catherine grew frantic, pacing the cold stone floors, praying that he would appear. When dawn broke, she was still alone. She ran to the cliffs, hoping to catch sight of Pierre, but there was no sign of him. What she didn't know was that Pierre had been caught by her father's men. He had been dragged to the cliffs and thrown into the churning sea below. But as Catherine stared out at the ocean, all she could hear was the sound of waves crashing, a cruel reminder of the love that had been stolen from her. In her despair, Catherine took a knife from her father's collection and drove it into her own chest, ending her life where the sea met the land. Her body was found by townsfolk the next morning, but Pierre's body was never recovered. After her death, strange occurrences began to be reported around St. Augustine's Chapel. The townspeople said they could hear the sound of soft weeping late at night, a faint, sorrowful cry that echoed through the chapel. Others claimed to have seen a figure, a woman in a white dress, standing near the cliffs where Catherine had fallen. But no one dared to venture too close. The very air around the chapel seemed to hum with an unexplainable energy. In the late 1800s, a group of historians and spiritualists visited the chapel to uncover the truth. They brought with them the latest equipment and set up cameras, prepared to document the paranormal activity. When they entered the chapel, the AIR grew noticeably colder, and the doors creaked as if something, or someone, was pressing against them. As the group explored the building, the weeping started. Soft, guttural sobs filled the air, growing louder by the second, until it became almost unbearable. The group followed the sound, finding their way to a small, abandoned room behind the altar. Inside, they found a portrait of Catherine, painted in the style of the ERA, hung crookedly on the wall. Beneath the portrait was an old wooden chest, locked and sealed shut. The investigators tried to open the chest, but it wouldn't budge. They heard a loud crash behind them, and when they turned around, the portrait of Catherine had shifted slightly, her eyes now following them as they moved around the room. As the crying grew more intense, a cold gust of wind blew through the chapel, extinguishing their candles. In the darkness, they heard a voice, a whisper, soft and desperate. Find him. Find him. When the investigators rushed to leave, they were greeted by the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them, though no one was there. The townspeople still speak of the crying woman, and some claim they've heard her mournful wails late at night. Some even say they've seen her standing near the cliffs, staring out at the horizon, waiting for Pierre to return. But no one has ever been brave enough to search the chest in the hidden room again. They say Catherine's spirit is still trapped in the chapel, waiting for her lost love to return, and as long as the chest remains sealed, the cries will never stop.